The night was colder than she'd expected for a spring evening in Wyoming. Claire Benton stood by the edge of the bonfire, her hands trembling, not just from the chill, but from the courage it took to be here. Sparks drifted up into the black sky where the stars hung sharp and silent, like witnesses to every whispered sin and secret in this dusty town. The townsfolk of Cedar Hollow had gathered for the annual Ranchers' Social, where every year laughter tried to hide the loneliness that lived in most hearts. Claire wasn't much of a talker nor a dancer. She worked as a cook at the Silver Mesa Ranch, quiet, dependable, and painfully shy. She didn't draw eyes, and she preferred it that way. At least, she used to, until she saw him again. Ethan Crowe, the heartbroken rancher everyone whispered about. He stood on the far side of the fire, hat low, his broad shoulders outlined in the flickering light. Even in silence, he carried the kind of sadness that made people turn away. They said his fiancée had died last winter, the preacher's daughter, the one with hair like sunlight and a smile that could make a man forget the dust. Some said Ethan hadn't smiled since. Claire hadn't meant to look at him for so long, but her gaze stayed, drawn to the weight he carried, the same kind of loneliness that echoed in her own chest. And then she saw Miss Abigail Rowe, the banker's daughter, laughing too loudly, walking toward Ethan with a look that said she saw an opportunity more than a man. Claire knew what was coming. They'd whisper again tomorrow, "Poor Ethan. Can't even say no." Something inside her stirred, not jealousy. Not exactly, but a strange, burning courage. Before she could talk herself out of it, she crossed the firelight. Ethan noticed her only when she was standing right there, holding a cup of coffee in both trembling hands. She looked up, her voice barely a whisper. "Can you pretend to be my boyfriend for one night?" The silence after that was heavy. A few heads turned. Even the fire crackled quieter. Ethan frowned, startled, eyes narrowing beneath the brim of his hat. "Ma'am, I think you've got the wrong man," he said, voice rough as gravel. Claire shook her head quickly, her face flushed crimson. "No, she stammered, her courage starting to slip. "It's just, people keep trying to set me up with Mr. Harris, the butcher. I don't want to be cornered again tonight. I thought maybe if you stood by me for a while, they'd stop." He looked at her, really looked. This tiny woman with flour-dusted hands and a voice like soft rain. She wasn't the kind of woman who made requests like this, and yet there she was, shaking but brave. After a long pause, Ethan tipped his hat. "One night," he said. "No more." And just like that, a deal was struck between two broken souls who had nothing left to lose. As the evening went on, they stood together under the starlit sky, pretending, or maybe half-pretending. The town saw them, whispered, and the gossip began to spin like tumbleweed across the street. Claire laughed once, softly. Ethan glanced down at her, surprised at the sound. It had been months since laughter reached him without breaking something inside, but just as the warmth started to feel real, just as his guard began to slip, a shadow stepped out of the dark. Sheriff O'Donnell, his expression hard. "Crowe," he said, voice tight. "We need to talk. There's been trouble down by the border creek, and your brother's name came up." The world around them seemed to fall silent again. Ethan's hand, which had been resting near Claire's, dropped to his side. Her heart tightened as she saw the storm return to his eyes. "Guess our pretending ends sooner than we thought," he muttered. But Claire didn't step back. For some reason she couldn't explain, she whispered, "Then let me come with you." He turned, startled again, but this time there was something new in his gaze. A flicker of trust, maybe even hope. The night wind swept through the prairie grass, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke and the beginning of something. Neither of them understood yet. Something that would change both their lives. Forever. The next morning came with a cold wind that howled across the plains. Dawn painted the horizon in pale gold, but the world still felt gray. Ethan Crowe saddled his horse in silence, his movements steady, deliberate. Every click of the buckle, every pull of the strap was a memory he didn't want. His brother's name, once spoken with pride, now whispered with suspicion. Claire stood by the barn door, clutching her shawl against the chill. She hadn't slept. Her thoughts circled the night before, the look in Ethan's eyes when the sheriff mentioned his brother. guilt, anger, and something else. Fear. You don't have to come, Ethan said, not looking at her. I know, she replied softly, stepping closer. But I want to. He turned then, really looking at her, the shy cook who barely spoke above a whisper now standing firm in the morning light. This isn't some town errand, Miss Benton. There's talk my brother got mixed up with a gang out by Border Creek. Men who don't think twice before pulling a trigger. I can handle danger, she said, though her hands trembled. I've lived through worse than silence. He didn't ask what she meant. He just nodded once, then handed her a spare coat and helped her mount the mare beside him. The ride was long and quiet. The land stretched endlessly, dry grass, jagged rocks, and the endless whisper of wind. Sometimes, Ethan glanced at her, wondering why she'd chosen to ride with him. Maybe she saw what he'd stopped believing, that he wasn't beyond saving. As they reached the creek, the sound of rushing water met them. And something else. A shot cracked through the air. Down! Ethan hissed, pulling her off the saddle. They dropped behind a fallen log as another bullet tore through the dust. Claire's heart raced. She could taste the fear in her throat. Stay low, he ordered, drawing his revolver. The world seemed to hold its breath as Ethan stepped into the open, returning fire with steady precision. When silence finally fell, he found a blood trail leading into the trees. Come on, he said, his voice rougher now. They're not gone yet. She followed without hesitation, and deep in those woods, beneath the scent of pine and gunpowder, Claire saw it. A figure slumped against a rock, blood on his coat. Ethan froze. It was his brother. No, Ethan whispered, dropping to his knees. The younger man's eyes flickered open, filled with pain and regret. They're coming, Ethan, he rasped. They know about the ranch. About her? His gaze shifted toward Claire. You have to protect her. Before Ethan could speak, his brother's eyes went still. The sound of hoofbeats echoed again, closer, faster. Ethan stood, jaw tight, revolver in hand. We need to go. Now! As Claire stared at the lifeless man and the shadows moving between the trees, she realized this wasn't just about pretending anymore. This was survival, and for the first time, Ethan didn't seem like a stranger. He seemed like the only person she could trust. Rain began to fall as the sun slipped behind the black mountains, turning the prairie into a blur of gray and thunder. Ethan rode fast, his coat soaked through, his mind a storm of its own. Claire clung to the saddle behind him, her fingers gripping his coat as the wind whipped her hair across her face. Neither spoke. There was nothing to say that wouldn't make it worse. After an hour, the rain turned heavier, and the first flashes of lightning showed an old mining cabin tucked against a ridge. Ethan pulled the reins hard and dismounted, helping Claire down before leading the horses inside. The place smelled of dust and old iron. Broken lanterns lay scattered across the floor, and cobwebs hung like ghosts in the corners. But it was shelter. Ethan found an old stove and struck a match. Soon, a small fire flickered to life, throwing light against the cracked wooden walls. Claire sat quietly, shivering, her wet dress clinging to her like second skin. You should change, Ethan muttered, tossing her a blanket. If you stay wet, you'll freeze, she nodded. Turning away modestly, and when she wrapped herself in the blanket, she sat closer to the fire, eyes lost in the flames. Your brother, she said softly, breaking the silence. He wasn't bad, was he? Ethan's jaw tightened. No, he just made bad choices. Got caught up with the wrong people after Pa died. I tried to pull him out, but he wouldn't listen. Said he wanted one last job to fix everything. He stared at the fire, the light hard in his eyes. Guess that job got him killed. Claire hesitated, then spoke gently. He died trying to protect you, and me. Maybe that means he found peace. He looked at her then, really looked. She wasn't just the shy cook from the ranch anymore. She was calm, steady, and braver than most men he'd ridden with. Outside, thunder rolled again, echoing like gunfire across the plains. Ethan stood and moved to the window, watching the darkness. They'll come for us before dawn, he said. The gang won't let his death go unanswered. Then we'll be ready. Claire said. He turned back to her, surprised at her calm. We? She gave a faint smile. You think I'd leave now? I asked you to pretend once, Ethan. But this isn't pretending anymore. The firelight danced across her face, softening her eyes, and for a brief moment, the storm outside seemed to fade. Ethan's chest ached with something he hadn't felt in months, something that felt like hope, or maybe the start of healing. He sat beside her, their shoulders barely touching. We'll make it through the night, he said quietly. After that, we'll figure out the rest. Claire nodded, her voice steady. Together. Outside, the rain poured harder, the storm howling like the ghosts of their pasts. But inside that tiny cabin, for the first time, two lonely souls found a reason to stay alive. The storm had passed by dawn, leaving behind a silence that felt wrong, too still, too expectant. Mist curled low across the ground outside the cabin, turning the world into a pale, ghostly haze. Ethan had been awake all night, his rifle across his lap, watching through the cracks in the boards. Claire slept for only a few hours, her head resting against the blanket, her breathing soft and steady. When the first light broke over the ridge, Ethan finally saw it. Movement. 5 riders, dark shapes emerging through the fog. The gang, his brother's men. He stood and moved quietly to the corner. Claire, he said in a low voice, wake up. They're here. She stirred, rubbing her eyes, fear flashing across her face when she saw his expression. What do we do? He loaded a shell into the chamber and handed her a small pistol. You stay behind me. If things go bad, you run for the horses. Don't look back. And leave you here? She whispered. I'll buy you time. But Claire shook her head. No, Ethan. Not again. You lost your brother because he tried to face them alone. We're not doing that twice. His eyes softened, but there was no time to argue. The sound of hooves stopped outside. Voices, boots crunching on wet earth. A man's voice called out, harsh and mocking. Crowe, we know you're in there. Come on out and we'll make it quick. Ethan glanced at Claire, nodded once, and stepped out into the doorway, rifle raised. The leader, a tall man with a scar down his cheek, grinned when he saw him. Always figured you'd end up running, Ethan. Shame about your brother. He talked too much before he died. Rage flickered across Ethan's face, but his voice stayed calm. Then let's finish it. Here and now. Gunfire shattered the morning. The air filled with dust and smoke as bullets tore through the cabin walls. Claire ducked low, returning fire when she saw shadows move near the windows. She wasn't trained, but her aim was steady. Steady enough to drop one man who tried to flank them. Ethan fought like a man with nothing left to lose. Every shot was clean, deliberate. The scarred leader fell last, his gun slipping from his hand as he collapsed in the mud. Silence followed, broken only by the faint cry of a hawk overhead. Ethan lowered his rifle slowly, chest heaving, sweat and rain mixing on his face. Claire stood behind him, her hands shaking but her eyes fierce. Is it over? She asked softly. He turned to her, gaze lingering. For now. And then, for the first time in what felt like years, Ethan smiled. Tired, broken, but real. You did good, he said. She stepped closer, her voice barely a whisper. You're not alone anymore, Ethan. Outside, the fog began to lift, revealing a world washed clean by rain. But both of them knew peace wouldn't come easy. There would be questions from the sheriff, whispers from the town, and ghosts that still waited in the distance. Still, for the first time, they didn't feel afraid of what was coming. The ride back to Cedar Hollow was quiet. The land stretched wide and silver beneath the late morning sun. Every hoofbeat echoed like a heartbeat, steady, cautious, uncertain. Ethan rode ahead, his shoulders heavy, the rifle strapped behind him. Claire followed close, wrapped in his old coat, her face pale but calm. The town came into view at noon. Small, familiar, and suddenly foreign. Word had already spread. By the time they reached Main Street, eyes followed them from behind curtains and porch rails. Whispers moved faster than wind. Sheriff O'Donnell stood outside his office, arms crossed. His gaze swept over Ethan, then stopped on Claire. You two look like you've been through hell. We were, Ethan said flatly, dismounting. He tossed a blood-stained badge onto the porch. His brother's. The gang's finished. But you should know, my brother wasn't one of them. He died trying to stop them. The sheriff's expression shifted, guilt flickering in his eyes. I heard the shots. Figured you wouldn't make it out. Guess I was wrong. You were, Ethan said, his voice low but steady. Inside the office, Ethan told him everything. How his brother had tried to leave the gang. How they'd hunted him down, and how the fight ended in blood by Border Creek. Claire sat quietly nearby, watching as Ethan's anger slowly drained away, leaving only sorrow. When it was over, the sheriff nodded. You did the right thing, Crowe. I'll make sure the record's clear. Your brother deserves that much. As they stepped back into the sunlight, the town seemed to breathe again. People nodded, murmured thanks, even offered shy smiles. For once, the stares weren't filled with judgment, only understanding. They walked toward the edge of town together, neither speaking until they reached the small rise overlooking the valley. The wind carried the scent of sage and dust, and somewhere far off, thunder rumbled again, the kind that promised rain, not ruin. You could stay, Claire said quietly, staring at the horizon. The ranch could use someone who knows how to keep it standing. Ethan looked at her, his face softening. And you? You still want to keep pretending? She smiled. A small, shy smile that reached her eyes this time. No, not pretending. Just staying. He stepped closer, brushing a strand of hair from her face. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was warm, like something fragile but real. Then I'll stay, he said. The wind stirred again, carrying the sound of the distant prairie. Lonely, endless, but somehow alive. They stood there for a long time, two souls who'd found each other in the ashes of pain, bound not by chance but by choice. And when Ethan finally took her hand, it felt like the end of one story, and the quiet beginning of another.